The swing at Sulak Canyon in Dagestan had become one of those attractions people visited for the thrill of the view as much as the ride itself. Perched near the edge of an enormous drop, it gave tourists the feeling of flying out over the canyon, and because it had reportedly been used many times before, the people stepping onto it likely assumed it was safe. That's what makes the footage so unsettling. Nothing about the moment suggests a disaster is about to happen until it already has. Two women were seated on the bench-like swing, suspended right at the edge of the canyon, when the ride suddenly failed. One second, they were moving through the air like every rider before them, and the next, a loud crack echoed out as one of the supporting chains snapped. The entire seat lurched violently to one side, and both women were thrown over the edge almost instantly. Their screams could be heard as they were flung outward, and for a brief moment, it looked like they were about to fall straight into the canyon below. However, instead of plunging all the way down, they landed on a narrow wooden platform just below the edge. It broke the fall enough to save their lives, leaving them with bruises and scratches instead of something far worse. Family members and bystanders who had been watching nearby ran toward them in panic and pulled them back to safety, still trying to process how close they had come to watching a deadly accident happen in front of them. Authorities later confirmed that the swing did not meet proper safety standards, and the attraction was shut down almost immediately. Afterward, officials began targeting similar swings in the region, recognizing that what happened here could easily have ended in a very different way. It was seconds that made the difference, and the next story comes down to that same kind of split-second decision. A red passenger bus was traveling through Jalisco, Mexico, when a white pickup truck suddenly sped past it and cut in front. At first, it may have looked like reckless driving, but that confusion lasted only seconds. The pickup came to a full stop ahead of the bus, blocking the lane, and armed men began stepping out. At that moment, it became clear that this wasn't traffic or road rage. It was an ambush. The driver had almost no time to decide what to do. If he braked and stopped, the passengers would be trapped. If he hesitated, the bus could become exactly what cartel roadblocks across the region had already turned so many other vehicles into: a target, a barricade, or a burning shell left behind on the highway. Instead of freezing, he swerved around the pickup and drove straight into it hard enough to shove it off the road. The force of that impact disrupted the attack before it could fully unfold. The armed men immediately abandoned the ambush and ran, while the bus managed to keep moving, carrying its passengers away from what could have become a massacre. The incident reportedly happened on February 22, 2026, during a wider wave of cartel violence triggered by the death of El Mencho, one of the most powerful cartel leaders in Mexico. Across Jalisco and surrounding areas, cartel members were reportedly blocking highways, burning vehicles, and creating flaming barricades in retaliation. Other buses had already been torched that same day, and footage from the wider unrest showed exactly what happened to passenger vehicles that didn't get through in time. That context is what makes this clip stand out even more. On its own, it looks like an extraordinary act of quick thinking by a bus driver under pressure. But with everything else happening around it, it becomes clear that the people on that bus were only seconds away from becoming part of a much larger wave of violence. The reason they didn't was because the driver understood almost immediately that stopping was not an option. And that takes us to this next clip, where another driver makes a split-second decision, but in this case, that choice turned everything worse. All this tourist wanted was a close-up shot with a wild elephant, but what he got instead was the kind of encounter that can go wrong so fast, there's barely time to regret it. The incident happened on the road, cutting through Bandipur Tiger Reserve in Karnataka, India, where a man stepped out of his vehicle and began walking toward an elephant standing near the roadside. From inside a car, an animal that size can still feel distant, almost manageable, especially when it isn't moving aggressively. But that illusion disappears the second you step into its space. The man, reportedly R. Basavaraj, pulled out his phone and moved closer, seemingly focused on getting photos rather than recognizing how dangerous the situation already was. Then the elephant turned. What follows is exactly the kind of reaction wildlife experts warn people about over and over again. the elephant charged almost immediately, closing the distance in seconds. The man tried to run, but there was no chance he was going to outrun it. He was knocked to the ground and then stomped repeatedly while lying on the road. For a moment, it looked as if the attack would not stop until he was dead. Eventually, the elephant backed away just enough for him to scramble to his feet and stagger toward safety. He was taken to a hospital and, despite how brutal the attack looked, survived with injuries that were reportedly not life-threatening. Forest officials later identified him, fined him 25,000 rupees, and required him to record a video statement acknowledging that he had violated reserve rules and ignored basic wildlife safety. What makes the clip so frustrating is that it was entirely avoidable. The elephant was not chasing cars, not charging traffic, not doing anything unpredictable until someone crossed the line and treated a wild animal like a tourist backdrop. And that's really the whole lesson in one sentence. The danger didn't suddenly appear when the elephant attacked. It was already there the moment he stepped out of the vehicle. And in the next clip, another man pushes his luck until control disappears completely. Officers deal with crash scenes all the time, but in Duane, New York, what should have been a routine response suddenly turned into something much worse. Trooper Bailey Martin was standing on the shoulder outside her patrol vehicle, speaking with another officer, while handling an earlier incident near the intersection of State Route 30 and State Route 458. Both patrol cars were clearly parked with emergency lights flashing, and from a distance, it looked like exactly the kind of scene any approaching driver would have more than enough time to notice. But that's not what happened. A gray Dodge Durango came toward the intersection and, instead of stopping, drove straight through. In a matter of seconds, it slammed directly into Trooper Martin, throwing her to the ground before crashing into her unoccupied patrol vehicle. The impact was so hard that it left heavy damage behind, twisting metal and turning what had been a controlled roadside stop into another emergency entirely. The body camera footage makes the moment even harder to watch because of how normal everything looks right before the collision. There's no dramatic buildup, no obvious warning beyond the vehicle approaching too quickly. Then, all at once, Martin is hit and the officer beside her is rushing to help. The people inside the SUV climb out moments later, clearly shaken, as the reality of what just happened starts to set in. Investigators later said the driver, identified as Colin Wannock, told them the sun's glare had impaired his vision and caused him to miss the stop sign. Martin was taken to a nearby medical center with non-life-threatening injuries and later returned to duty, while the occupants of the SUV also suffered minor injuries. Even so, the footage leaves behind the same unsettling thought that a lot of roadside officers probably know too well. Sometimes the danger at a crash scene isn't the wreck you're responding to, but the next vehicle that hasn't slowed down yet. That scene changed in a second. The next one does too, only with a lot more force behind it. When Peter Fisioli was found dead after a fire at his bungalow in Northolt, West London, the case didn't immediately look suspicious. He was 58, lived alone, worked as an IT consultant, and from the outside, his life appeared quiet and routine. The fire seemed like the obvious story, and at first, that was exactly how it was treated. A tragic accident. Smoke inhalation. A man with an existing heart condition who hadn't made it out. But sometimes what makes a case disturbing is not what investigators miss in the beginning, but how easily the truth is able to hide behind something that looks ordinary. Peter had arranged to meet someone through an online platform, a man calling himself Gabriel. The encounter was supposed to involve role play, specifically the kind built around authority and control, and Peter appears to have believed he was inviting someone into his home for something consensual and understood. CCTV later showed the man arriving in a way that supported that impression. He wasn't sneaking around, and he wasn't trying to hide who he was pretending to be. The fire happened in the early hours of January 7, 2013, and because the scene initially seemed to support an accidental death, the case was closed. But later, people noticed Peter's bank accounts were still being used. That detail did raise questions, but not enough at first to completely overturn the original conclusion. Everything changed nearly 2 years later when Peter's nephew recovered a computer hard drive that had survived the fire. On it were recordings from a webcam inside the bungalow, including footage from Peter's final hours. That footage changed the case completely. What began looking like a consensual meeting slowly shifted into something else entirely. The man calling himself Gabriel, later identified as Jason Marshall, pushed far beyond anything Peter had agreed to. The tone changed, the control became real, and it became obvious that Peter was no longer a willing participant in what was happening. He was being overpowered, and after that, the camera captured something even worse. The suspect moving around calmly afterward, and the sound of liquid being poured before the fire was started. That one detail destroyed the original theory. The fire had not caused Peter's death. It had been used to cover it up. Once police had the footage, the case was reopened immediately. Marshall was identified, and it emerged that he had a history of impersonating authority figures. He later traveled abroad and attempted similar behavior with another victim who survived, which helped lead to his arrest. He was eventually extradited back to the UK, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 39 years. What makes Peter Fisioli's case so deeply unsettling is how close it came to disappearing forever under the wrong explanation. If that hard drive hadn't survived, his death might still be officially remembered as an accidental fire instead of what it really was, a carefully staged murder built on deception and trust. And that takes us from a case where appearances concealed the real danger to a crash where everything seemed manageable right up until the moment it wasn't. And sometimes the most frustrating cases are the ones where the footage exists, but the answer still doesn't. That's what makes the killing of 23-year-old Mohammed Ahmed so unsettling. Police had CCTV, they had movement, they had timing. They had 3 men captured on camera, 2 on bikes and 1 on foot, with one of them wearing a distinctive jacket. And yet, even with all of that, the people investigators believed were central to the case were never publicly identified. Mohammed was shot dead near Turnpike Lane in North London in the early hours of May 28, 2021. From the beginning, police did not believe it was random. Instead, they suspected his murder was connected to an earlier firearms incident in Park Lane, in 17, where another man had been injured not long before. That earlier incident matters because it changes how the whole case looks. It suggests that what happened to Mohammed may not have been a spontaneous attack at all, but part of something already in motion. CCTV from the earlier shooting reportedly showed a man in that same distinctive jacket helping take the injured person to hospital before leaving again. Police believed that people linked to that earlier violence later traveled in a Honda Civic toward Turnpike Lane, and that Mohammed may have been found in or near Duckett's Common before shots were fired from the car. If that theory is right, then this wasn't just one shooting. It was a continuation of another one, and that's where the case becomes so frustrating. The outline is there, the possible sequence is there. Police clearly believed those 3 men on CCTV mattered. But despite a murder investigation, a later arrest, and public appeals, the case remained unresolved in public. One man was arrested in June 2021 on suspicion of murder, but he was later released under investigation, and after that, everything seemed to stall. What adds another layer to the story is the way local people reportedly reacted. Some weren't shocked so much as exhausted. There were quotes suggesting that serious violence in the area had become something people were used to, and that is disturbing in a different way. It suggests that this wasn't just about one victim, but about a wider atmosphere where retaliation, silence, and fear had become familiar enough that even murder no longer felt surprising. That's part of why Mohammed Ahmed's case still lingers. It isn't only an unsolved shooting. It's a case where the city seems to have watched pieces of the truth move past on camera, but never fully caught up with them. The footage showed routes, clothing, timing, and possible connection, but the one thing detectives still needed most was a name. Until that changes, the case remains exactly what makes CCTV so frustrating sometimes. Evidence that gets you close, but not close enough. Now, after a story shaped by fear, tension, and split-second violence, this last clip shows a very different kind of panic behind the wheel. At first glance, This CCTV didn't look like the beginning of a murder case. It just showed a young man walking out of an apartment building in Stoke-on-Trent, holding a set of keys that weren't his. A few seconds later, he dropped them outside and looked down at his hands, almost like he was only just realizing something wasn't right. There was blood on them. By the time neighbors found those same keys and recognized them as belonging to 18-year-old Megan Newton, confusion had already started turning into something much worse. Megan was the kind of person people trusted. She worked hard, volunteered as a youth football coach, helped raise money for children, and had real plans for her future. She wanted to be the first in her family to go to university and study physiotherapy or sports therapy, and people around her believed she would get there. On the night of April 19, 2019, nothing about her evening stood out as unusual. She finished work at a fish and chip shop, met up with friends, and went out. She seemed happy, relaxed, and excited, even showing off a new tattoo. Later that night, after the clubs had closed, she ran into 19-year-old Joseph Trevor at a taxi rank. She knew him from school, and because they had both been into sports, there was already some level of familiarity there. He told her he wasn't in a good state and was worried about going home. Megan, being the kind of person she was, offered to let him stay over at her flat. To her, it was probably nothing more than a kind gesture. To everyone who knew her, it was completely in character. CCTV later showed the two of them arriving back at her apartment together. They looked calm. There was no sign of panic, no visible tension, nothing to suggest that within a few hours Megan would be dead and he would be the only one leaving. What happened inside the apartment was later pieced together through forensic evidence and Trevor's own admissions. Megan was attacked in a way that was both prolonged and deeply violent. It wasn't something impulsive or unclear. The injuries made that painfully obvious. After leaving the flat, Trevor reportedly told friends he had done something bad. Police arrested him not long after, and during the trial, he first tried to suggest that what happened had been consensual, but that story didn't survive contact with the evidence. In the end, he pleaded guilty to murder and rape and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of over 21 years. But even with that sentence, Megan's case is still hard to sit with, because it began with something so ordinary. She saw someone she thought she knew, decided to help him, and that one small act of kindness ended up costing her everything. That's what makes it linger. The danger didn't look dangerous until it was already far too late. And that takes us from a danger that hid behind familiarity to one that people stood right next to without fully respecting it. In Iceland, a case like the one of Birna Brjánsdóttir's doesn't just make headlines, they shake the entire country. That's because Iceland has long had a reputation for being one of the safest places in the world, the kind of place where people genuinely believe they can walk home alone at night without needing to worry too much. So when Birna disappeared in January 2017, it didn't just feel tragic, it felt almost impossible. Birna was 20 years old, living in Reykjavik, working in retail, and known by friends and family as funny, dependable, and full of life. She was close to both of her parents and to the people around her, and on the night of January 13th, she did what so many young people do. She went out after work, met up with friends, and stayed out later than some of them. By all accounts, it was a completely ordinary night. CCTV later showed her walking through Reykjavik in the early hours of the morning after leaving a club, stopping for food, dropping a few coins outside a shop, and continuing on. There was nothing in that footage that immediately looked like danger. She looked like someone heading home after a late night out. Slightly unsteady maybe, tired maybe, but not frightened. And that's part of what made the case so upsetting. The last confirmed footage of Birna didn't look dramatic or suspicious. It looked normal. The concern started quickly when she failed to show up for work and nobody could get hold of her. In a bigger country, a disappearance like that might take time to gain attention, but Iceland is different. Missing persons cases there are rare, and almost immediately her face was everywhere. Search teams were organized, social media spread updates across the country, and the case became something people followed almost collectively. The breakthrough came when searchers found boots matching the ones Birna had been wearing. Investigators then focused on a red Kia Rio linked to the Greenlandic fishing vessel Polar Nanook. The car had already been cleaned, which in itself raised alarm, but forensic testing still found Birna's blood inside. At that point, the case moved from missing person to murder investigation. Thomas Müller-Olsen, a crew member connected to the vessel, became the main suspect. By then, the ship had already left Icelandic waters, which made the whole situation feel even more surreal, but authorities managed to get it turned around. Once it returned, police boarded it and arrested him. He later admitted Birna had entered the car, but claimed he had dropped her off safely. The evidence told a different story. Birna's body was eventually found near the coastline, and the investigation concluded that she had been attacked and left to die in the freezing water. In 2017, Olsen was convicted and sentenced to 19 years in prison, which was the maximum sentence allowed in Iceland at the time. What stayed with so many people wasn't just the crime itself, but what it did to the country's sense of safety. Birna's case forced a lot of people to face something they had never really wanted to believe: that even in a place known for feeling safe, one ordinary walk home can still end in the worst possible way. Now, from a case where everything changed during an ordinary walk home, we move to a moment where a yacht becomes just as helpless once the conditions turn. Residents in Albacetine, Cairo, looked up on February 24, 2026, and saw a scene that must have felt almost impossible to process in real time. Hanging from the outside of a 10-story building was a man who had reportedly been caught trying to rob an apartment. Instead of fleeing through a hallway or stairwell, he had somehow ended up on the outside of the building, clinging to the structure and trying to make his way down floor by floor. The footage shows him hanging from the 10th floor, gripping air conditioning units and window edges, while people below watched in horror, fully aware that one slip would almost certainly kill him. When he was first spotted, he jumped down to the floor below, landing hard on an AC unit before continuing downward. His legs hung in open air while he shifted from one ledge to the next, clearly panicked and desperate to find a way out. What makes the scene even stranger is how the people inside the building responded. As he climbed lower, some residents opened their windows and called out to him, inviting him inside so he would not risk falling to his death. According to reports, some even told him they would not alert police if he just stopped climbing and came in. But he refused every offer, either too frightened or too focused on escaping to trust anyone trying to help. By the time he reached the 5th floor, he was visibly exhausted. He hung there for several long moments before finally dropping down into a lower construction area. But once he landed, it became obvious that he had not really escaped at all. He was trapped with no clear route out, and reports say that after realizing he had nowhere left to go, he broke down and began to cry. Police arrived shortly after and arrested him at the scene. Later, he reportedly confessed that he had climbed the building to commit theft. What makes the whole clip so tense is that for most of it, the actual arrest almost feels secondary. The real question the entire time is whether he is going to survive his own escape attempt. The clip was tense because you spend the whole time wondering whether he's going to survive what the camera is showing. In this last story, however, CCTV creates a different kind of dread. By the time police asked the public for help, everyone already understood that this was serious. A 21-year-old university student had disappeared overnight, and the only thing investigators had at first was a trail of CCTV clips and witness sightings that didn't quite fit together. No clear answer, no obvious explanation, just one small piece after another. Libby Squire was a philosophy student at the University of Hull. People described her as bright, funny, warm, and deeply close to her family. She had moved to Hull to build a new life for herself. And like a lot of students, she was trying to balance independence, friendships, and the pressure that comes with being away from home. On January 31st, 2019, she went out with friends for a night in the city. At some point, after drinking, she was refused entry to a nightclub because she was too intoxicated, so her friends put her in a taxi and sent her home. That should have been the end of the story. It should have been the part where she got inside, went to bed, and woke up embarrassed the next morning. But when the taxi dropped her off near her house on Wellesley Avenue, she didn't go in. CCTV showed her wandering instead, clearly vulnerable, confused, and not fully in control of what she was doing. Over the next hour, people saw her sitting on the ground, crying, lying down, and at times refusing help. It's one of the hardest parts of the case to look back on, because so many people noticed that something wasn't right, but no one knew just how wrong things were about to become. Then came the silver Vauxhall Astra. CCTV showed it passing her on Beverly Road, parking nearby, and the driver appearing to watch her before eventually approaching. A short time later, Libby got into the car. That was the last confirmed moment she was seen alive. For a while, what happened after that was unclear. There was a witness who heard a scream near Oak Road playing Fields around the same time, and CCTV put the same vehicle in that area before and after. Police eventually connected the car to Pavel Relowich, a local man who claimed he had simply tried to help Libby and then left her. But as investigators looked deeper, that explanation started to collapse. His behavior, the forensic evidence, and the wider timeline all pointed in a much darker direction. When Libby's body was found in the Humber Estuary on March 20th, 2019, the case changed completely. The condition of her remains made some details hard to prove with total precision, but there was enough evidence to tie Relowich directly to her final movements and to what happened afterward. In 2021, he was convicted of rape and murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 27 years. What makes Libby's case so haunting is how normal the evening looked right up until it didn't. A night out with friends, a taxi home, a short walk on a familiar street. None of those things sound extraordinary on their own, but when they're placed in the wrong order at the wrong time, with the wrong person entering the picture, they become something irreversible. Now that was all for today, folks. If you enjoyed these horrifying clips, click to see more on the video on screen.